Well, hello and a very warm welcome to the start of our 30th season, season 30 of the History Network. Thank you for all of you who are patrons of the podcast. This really does make the podcast possible. And if you'd like to become a patron, then just pop along to Patreon, patreon.com/The History Network to find out more about that there. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 30, Episode 1, The Vicksburg Campaign, Part 1. Today's episode was written by J.A. Henderson. Major Henderson holds a Master of Arts in International Relations from the University of Oklahoma and recently completed a Masters of Military Arts and Sciences from the United States Army's Command and General Staff College, where his thesis focused on operational level leadership. He previously wrote for us in Episode 6 of Season 28, Lieutenant General Sir Geoffrey Amherst and the Conquest of New France. By the winter of 1862, the American Civil War was going poorly for the Union. Begun in 1861 with the secession of 11 Confederate states from the United States, Confederate forces had more than held their own in the field against Union armies. In the Eastern Theater, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee had checked 3 attempts by the Union to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, and in mid-December 1862, Lee decisively defeated Major General Ambrose Burnside's Union Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Fredericksburg. As winter set in, both sides stared at each other across the Rappahannock River, locked in a stalemate. While the Eastern Theatre stagnated, though, in the Western Theatre, Union forces were focused on the capture of the Confederate fortress city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Situated on the DeSoto Peninsula, high on a bluff overlooking a horseshoe-shaped bend in the Mississippi River, the city of Vicksburg was strategically vital for the Confederates. It blocked Union navigation of the Mississippi River and allowed communication between the Confederate states east and west of the river, the latter upon which the Confederate states depended extensively for horses, cattle, and reinforcements. Confederate President Jefferson Davis proclaimed, "Vicksburg is the nail head that holds the South's 2 halves together." The natural attributes of the city made it ideal for defence, earning Vicksburg the nickname the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. First, there was the 200-foot red clay escarpment dominating the hairpin bend of the river at its base, unscalable for infantry, and affording the guns emplaced on its crest a deadly plunging fire against whatever naval forces moved against or past it. As for land forces, since they could not scale the bluff itself, their only alternative would be to attack it from the rear, but attacking Vicksburg from the rear would not be easy. North and east of the city was the Mississippi Delta, an area 200 miles long by 50 miles across, which, for all practical purposes, were untamed wildernesses, utterly impassable by a man on horseback or by any form of wheeled vehicle, and very difficult even for a man on foot. In addition to the formidable natural defences, Vicksburg was a bastion of fortification, surrounded by numerous defences, including 9 major forts or redans. The city had 172 guns that commanded all approaches by water and land, and was protected by a 30,000-troop garrison. Union President Abraham Lincoln himself had pinpointed Vicksburg's importance when he pointed to a national map and said, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until the key is in our pocket." The man Lincoln chose for the job was Major General Ulysses S. Grant, Already a Union hero after capturing Forts Henry and Donelson and defeating Confederate forces at Shiloh, Grant's historic campaign to capture Vicksburg has been called the most brilliant and innovative campaign of the Civil War and one of the classic campaigns of military history. A US Army field manual even went so far as to describe the expedition as the most brilliant campaign ever fought on American soil. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio on April 27, 1822. Grant received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point and graduated on June 30, 1843, ranked 21st out of 39 in his class. He served in the Mexican-American War and was promoted to captain for his bravery and leadership. After the war, and impatient with garrison military life, Grant resigned from the army in 1854. After the outbreak of the Civil War, Grant rejoined the army, and on August 5, 1861, he was appointed as Brigadier General of Volunteers. On September 1, 1861, Grant assumed command of the units that would eventually become the Army of the Tennessee. As 1862 came to a close, Major General Grant and his army prepared to march south. Tasked to support Grant's campaign was Rear Admiral David D. Porter. Porter commanded 58 combat vessels, including 13 ironclads, 6 rams, 13 mortar boats, a sizable fleet of army transports, and hospital boats. Thus Grant was assured of overwhelming firepower any time his army had access to navigable water. In November 1862, Grant launched his first attempt to take Vicksburg. Rather than a direct attack, his objective was to outflank Vicksburg and force the evacuation of the city. Grant's plan called for a two-pronged assault. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman would advance down the river with 30,000 men, while Grant, with 40,000 men, would march south from Grand Junction, Tennessee, along the Mississippi Central Railroad. Confederate General John Pemberton, a West Pointer from Pennsylvania who had chosen to fight for the South, assembled 30,000 troops to contest Grant's advance. Grant hoped to fix Pemberton away from the city to allow Sherman's wing to mount a riverborne attack against Vicksburg. Instead of committing to a static defence, though, Pemberton continued to fall back on defensive lines nearer to Vicksburg, refusing to engage in combat and forcing Grant to extend his supply lines. This tactic proved successful, and on December 20th, Confederate raids by Major General Earl Van Dorn and Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest disrupted Grant's lines of communication and destroyed his supply depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi. Unable to subsist his army without these supplies, Grant abandoned his overland advance. While Grant struggled to fix Pemberton north of Vicksburg, Sherman continued his move down the Mississippi River. Sherman's goal was to secure a lodgment somewhere near Vicksburg, or, if able, to seize the city itself. Sherman needed to force a landing quickly to relieve the pressure on Grant. His massive convoy of 60 transports, escorted by Porter's gunboats, departed from Memphis on December 20th, coincidentally the same day Van Dorn's raiders destroyed Grant's camp at Holly Springs. Recognizing that the heavy batteries at Vicksburg made an attack on the town itself impractical, Sherman disembarked his forces short of the city to approach it from the northeast. By December 28th, Sherman's 30,000 men were advancing on the Confederates at Chickasaw Bayou. Pemberton, no longer threatened due to Grant's forced retreat, rushed reinforcements by rail south to Vicksburg. By the time Sherman's troops were in position to cross the bayou and assault the bluffs, Pemberton had 15,000 men waiting to meet him. On December 29th, Sherman ordered a frontal assault, but due in part to the nature of the terrain and to confusion in the Union ranks, less than half of Sherman's force was fully engaged. The attack was repulsed with heavy casualties totaling 208 killed, 1,005 wounded and 563 missing. Sherman attempted some additional, ultimately ineffective manoeuvres and was forced to withdraw upstream on December 31st. While Grant and Sherman were suffering their respective repulses, another Union general was trying his luck at taking Vicksburg. John McClernand, a prominent Democratic politician from Illinois, had used his political influence with Abraham Lincoln to obtain authority for an expedition of his own against Vicksburg. McClernand was furious to hear that the troops he had raised for his own expedition had been appropriated by Sherman while McClernand was recruiting additional forces in Illinois. McClernand met up with Sherman's force returning from their repulse at Chickasaw Bayou and angrily assumed command of their combined forces, which he renamed the Army of the Mississippi. Now 32,000 strong, the new army moved upstream, manoeuvring against Fort Hindman, a base from which Confederate gunboats were attacking Union shipping. Arriving in front of the fort on January 9th, 1863, McClernand began his attack 2 days later as Porter's squadron moved past the fort to cut off the garrison's retreat. As a result of this envelopment and pressure from a frontal attack, the Confederates surrendered. Despite the successful capture of Fort Hindman, Grant considered McClernand's endeavour to be a wild goose chase, and on January 13th Grant assumed personal command of the campaign, observing that 2 commanders on the same field are always one too many. Grant absorbed the Army of the Mississippi entirely into his Army of the Tennessee and organised his enlarged command into 3 corps. The 13th Corps under McClernand, the 15th Corps under Sherman, and the 17th Corps under his young protégé, Major General James B. McPherson. Grant assembled his new army 15 miles northwest of Vicksburg and began planning for his next campaign against the city. Between late January and early April 1863, Grant attempted 5 times to bypass Confederate fortifications and manoeuvre his army onto the bluffs either north or south of Vicksburg. All of these ventures attempted to use or construct alternative waterways rather than to steam past the batteries overlooking the Mississippi River, and all of them ended in failure. Historians have collectively labelled these operations Grant's Bayou operations. Grant first attempted to cut a canal across the peninsula opposite Vicksburg, bypassing the batteries on the bluff and landing below the town. Sherman's corps began digging the canal in February, but on March the 7th the river broke through the dam and flooded the area. Unable to continue their work, and with a Confederate artillery battery now firing on labourers, work on the canal was abandoned in late March. Meanwhile, McPherson's corps began another project far upstream at Lake Providence, Louisiana. The plan was to use the Mississippi River to flood a series of minor river networks and create a passage leading far below Vicksburg. Work began on February 3rd, and even though some light transports were able to navigate this new river, they would only be able to land 8,500 men, far too few to be of any consequence in an assault. Attempt number 2 was therefore abandoned. On the same day that work began at Lake Providence, engineers cut the levee at Yazoo Pass even further upstream, beginning what was called the Yazoo Pass Expedition. To counter this expedition, Confederate forces felled trees across the river to delay the Union forces. By the time a Union flotilla successfully navigated the narrow waterways, the Confederates had quickly constructed Fort Pemberton near Greenwood, Mississippi. For the next 3 weeks, Union gunboats engaged the fort, but unable to silence its guns, the Union forces withdrew in early April. Admiral Porter began the 4th such attempt on March 14th, attempting to navigate up the Yazoo Delta to Deer Creek just north of Vicksburg. This would outflank the newly constructed Fort Pemberton and allow Grant to land troops between Vicksburg and Yazoo City. Confederate Patrols again dropped trees into the channel to slow the river squadron's movement, and when they began to drop trees behind him, Porter halted his advance and backed his way out to save his boats from being trapped. Grant's final attempt to tame the bayou was to dig a 3-mile canal between the Mississippi and Big Bayou at Duckport, Louisiana. By April 13th, the canal was ready to accept its first vessels, but on April 18th, the Mississippi receded rapidly. The Duckport Canal dried out within a week, and this attempt was abandoned as well. Frustrated by his failed attempts to outflank the city, Grant now decided on a bolder plan. He would march his army down the west bank of the Mississippi to a point below Vicksburg, while sending the fleet straight past the batteries to rendezvous with the troops downriver. There they would ferry the army across the river for a dry ground campaign against the city. Grant would be virtually cut off from his base, for while the ships could get downriver past Vicksburg with the help of a 4-knot current, the ironclad vessels did not have sufficient power to return upstream. Grant's staff and his most trusted subordinates, Sherman and McPherson, opposed the plan, but Grant was adamant that an audacious manoeuvre was needed. He later wrote of the plan that, "The problem for us was to move forward to a decisive victory or our cause was lost. No progress was being made in any other field, and we had to go on." At 10 p.m. on April 16th, Admiral Porter led his fleet of 7 ironclad gunboats, 4 steamers, and an assortment of towed coal barges downstream. They were under fire for 2 hours as they ran the gauntlet past the Vicksburg guns. Miraculously, only 1 vessel was lost, and Porter's men suffered no casualties. With the river squadron in position, Grant began to march his army south. To ensure Pemberton did not discover his true intentions, Grant employed 2 feints, which prevented Confederate forces from concentrating on the Union crossing site. First, Grant dispatched Colonel Benjamin Grierson on a cavalry raid deep into Confederate-held territory. From April 17th to May 2nd, Grierson and his 1,700 mounted troopers rode over 600 miles from Tennessee through Mississippi and into Louisiana. They destroyed railroads, freed slaves, burnt Confederate storehouses, and inflicted 10 times the casualties they received. Most importantly, Grierson's raid forced Pemberton to use an entire division of soldiers to defend the vital Vicksburg-Jackson Railroad. The Grierson raid, combined with a feint by Sherman northeast of Vicksburg, misled the Confederates as to Grant's true purpose, and on April 30th the main Union force of 25,000 men landed unopposed on the east bank of the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg and began marching inland toward Port Gibson. Of the crossing, Grant would later write in his memoirs that, "I felt a degree of relief scarcely ever equalled since I was now in the enemy's country, with a vast river and the stronghold of Vicksburg between me and my base of supplies. But I was on dry ground, on the same side of the river with the enemy. All the campaigns, labours, hardships, and exposures from the month of December previous to this time that had been made and endured were for the accomplishment of this one object." As relieved as Grant may have been, he was not out of the woods yet. The morning after the crossing, he was forced to fight an all-day battle against 2 Confederate brigades, throwing them back and taking the crossroads town of Port Gibson. Pemberton now grasped his precarious situation. From Vicksburg he accurately and somewhat desperately telegraphed Richmond, "A furious battle has been going on since daylight just below Port Gibson. Enemy's movement threatens Jackson, and if successful, cuts off Vicksburg and Port Hudson from the east." Grant was not ready to strike Pemberton, though, and he first needed to bring up the remainder of Sherman's 15 Corps. While Sherman marched south to join Grant, arriving at Grand Gulf on May 7th, Grant planned his next move. He decided to drive northeast towards Edwards. Just as Pemberton feared, the Union capture of Edwards would cut the southern railroad running between Vicksburg and Jackson and isolate Vicksburg for a Union assault. While attempting to cut Pemberton's supply lines, Grant was less concerned about his own. For this latest attempt to take the city, Grant intended to cut loose from his base, travel light, and live off the country, avoiding his past mistakes of using long and vulnerable supply lines. On May 3rd, Grant reported to General Henry Halleck that the country will supply all the forage required for an active campaign and the necessary fresh beef. The very same day, Grant wrote to Sherman, "The road to Vicksburg is open, and all we need are men, ammunition, and hard bread. We can subsist our horses on the country and obtain considerable supplies for the troops." Grant had decided that the army would live partially off the land, with wagon trains bringing up such essential supplies as medicine, ammunition, and some rations. With his forces united and his supply lines secure, Grant began his advance towards Edwards. Pemberton, having finally discerned Grant's intentions, brought forward 3 of his 5 divisions to the vicinity of Edwards and the railroad bridge over the Big Black River. Unaware of the Confederate movements, on May 12th, McPherson's corps stumbled into an unexpected battle at Raymond. Confederate Brigadier General John Gregg's brigade surprised McPherson with a volley of fire as he approached 14-Mile Creek. McPherson was able to stabilize his line after 2 hours of bloody fighting, and the weight of numbers finally allowed the Union regiments to push the Confederates back. Gregg disengaged his brigade and withdrew to Jackson. While Grant may have been ignorant of Pemberton's disposition, the Battle of Raymond made him aware of a new Confederate army operating in the area. On May 13th, Confederate General Joseph Johnston had arrived at Jackson with 6,000 soldiers. That evening, Grant altered his entire plan for the campaign. It was imperative that he insert his army between Pemberton and Johnston before they had a chance to combine their forces. On May 13th, Grant directed McPherson and Sherman to march on Jackson, while McClernand established a defensive screen to protect their rear from Pemberton's forces at Edwards. On the morning of May 14th, McPherson and Sherman converged on Jackson. Although McPherson's lead division initially encountered stiff resistance, the Confederate rear guard eventually broke contact and abandoned Jackson, covering the withdrawal of Johnston's entire force to the northeast. With Johnston in retreat, Grant immediately turned his attention to Pemberton. Receiving intelligence that Pemberton was marching his army east to link up with Johnston, Grant moved decisively in an attempt to prevent Pemberton and Johnston from joining forces. Accordingly, on the morning of May 15th, he launched McClernand westward on the 3 routes Pemberton was likely to employ on his march, hurrying up McPherson to join McClernand while leaving Sherman to complete the destruction of Jackson. By that evening, Grant had 32,000 men converging on Champion Hill just east of Edwards. In contrast to Grant's bold action, Pemberton now floundered. Disoriented by the rapid pace of events, he was paralyzed by indecision. While Pemberton's own inclination was to occupy defensive positions near Edwards and make Grant attack him, Johnston ordered Pemberton to abandon Vicksburg for the time being and join their forces to defeat Grant. Pemberton could then reoccupy Vicksburg at his leisure. Pemberton called a council of war with his division commanders to resolve this dilemma. Instead, the council of war came up with a third option. The army would strike southeastward from Edwards to cut Grant's supply line, while the Union army was busy at Jackson. This scheme reconciled neither with Johnston's orders nor with Pemberton's own desire for a defensive stand. However, this was the plan Pemberton adopted. The next morning, with his forces already in motion, Pemberton received a message from Johnston informing him for the first time that Jackson had fallen and that Johnston had retreated to the northeast. The news stunned Pemberton. The Union force near Champion Hill, which Pemberton had assumed to be a Union rear guard, might as well be, and in fact was, Grant's main body. Pemberton's first reaction was to order his army to reverse course and withdraw to Edwards. Persuaded by his subordinates that it was too risky to withdraw in the face of the enemy, Pemberton reluctantly ordered his army to form for battle. The crucial Battle of Champion Hill, fought on May 16, 1863, pitted 29,000 Federals against 20,000 Confederates. Despite his reluctance to fight, Pemberton had placed his forces well along a 4-mile line in good defensive positions atop an L-shaped ridgeline. At the corner of this forested higher ground, 18 miles east of Vicksburg, was Champion Hill. Starting at 7 in the morning on May 16th, McPherson vigorously attacked the Confederate left, finally overrunning Pemberton's flank after several hours of bloody fighting. By 4 in the afternoon, McPherson had taken Champion Hill, and the main body of Confederates fell back in demoralized fashion to the Big Black River, now only 10 miles east of Vicksburg. The Battle of Champion Hill had cost Pemberton heavily. While Union and Confederate casualties were similar in number, Grant had succeeded in cutting off Brigadier General William Loring's entire division of 7,800 men from the rest of Pemberton's force. Loring attempted to rendezvous with Johnston, but his division would play no further role in the campaign for Vicksburg. Prior to the battle, the Confederates actually outnumbered the Union forces under Grant, but with Johnston driven off in the Battle of Jackson and Pemberton mauled at Champion Hill, Grant could proceed to assault Vicksburg in relative safety. While Grant's army was likely safe from destruction, Vicksburg was not yet taken. Eager to keep up the pressure on the retreating Confederates, on May 17th, McClernand's corps pushed westward toward the Big Black River. Upon reaching the river, he found Brigadier General John Bowen's Confederates manning earthworks in a bridgehead east of the railroad bridge. McClernand began forming 2 divisions for an assault on Bowen's position, but the battle was over almost before it started. Using a ridge to obscure his forces from Confederate observation, Brigadier General Michael Lawler moved his brigade forward and then launched a swift and vigorous attack on Bowen's division. Surprised by the sudden onslaught, the inexperienced Confederates broke and ran after only 3 minutes under fire. Bowen's force withdrew in disorder and confusion, hastily burning the bridges across the Big Black River to prevent Union pursuit. At the conclusion of the brief battle, Union forces captured nearly 1,800 Confederate prisoners for the loss of only 279 Union casualties. Pemberton now ordered the remnants of his army back to the fortifications of Vicksburg. One civilian who witnessed the arrival of Pemberton's army in Vicksburg that afternoon wrote, "I shall never forget that woeful sight of a beaten, demoralized army that came rushing back. Humanity in the last throes of endurance. Wan, hollow-eyed, ragged, footsore, bloody, the men limped along in aimless confusion." And there we will leave the Vicksburg campaign for this episode and rejoin it in a couple of weeks' time. If you would like to write a script for the History Network, then drop us a line. info@thehistorynetwork.org. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, which we would greatly appreciate because it makes the podcast possible, then please do pop along to Patreon, patreon.com, and find out about becoming a patron there. Thank you so much to all our patrons. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Major J.A. Henderson, read by Nick Barker.